Panel discussion. Different identities in our deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing communities. Brought to you by Minnesota Department of Human Services, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division.
Hi, my name is TJay. I work for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division within the Department of Human Services as a regional supervisor. It's exciting to be involved in the lives of Minnesotans all over the state who identify as deaf, deafblind, hard of hearing, and people with varying hearing loss and diversity, as well as members of the LGBTQ community. It's great to be a part of the panel, and I'm looking forward to seeing this. And now let's introduce our panelists. First off, we have Xavier Arana, who is deaf and Hispanic. He serves as a board member of the Minnesota Commission of the Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing. He also serves as a board member of the Minneapolis Advisory Committee on People with Disabilities. To my right, we have Regina Daniels, who is a Black female and identifies as deaf. She is an associate professor and program director at the ASL Interpreting Program at North Central University and is also a deaf interpreter. All right, and to my far left, we have Patrick Vellia, who is a cisgendered, white, gay male who also identifies as deafblind. He is a contractor for the Minnesota Commission of the Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing as part of their civic engagement team. He was born and raised in New York and was mainstreamed throughout school. After graduating from high school in 2006, he and his parents moved to North Carolina, where he earned a BA in American Sign Language with a minor in Business Administration. That was in 2015. Our next panelist is Mai Vang, who is a cisgendered female who identifies as Hmong and deaf. Mai attended a DHH program in elementary school and then went on to mainstream in middle and high school in the St. Paul Public Schools. Mai currently works at Think Self as a learner advocate who works with deaf and hard of hearing in the education department. Mai is one of the co-founders of the United Hmong with Disabilities organization that focus on the Hmong community with diversity and disability backgrounds and brings awareness and disability to the Hmong community by sharing disability stories and resources. Mai will be receiving her degree in the Bachelor of Human Services from Metropolitan State. And now our final panelist is Keenan Gao. Keenan is a Chinese individual who identifies as hard of hearing. Keenan moved here back in 2015 with her family and has been a proud Minnesotan ever since. Keenan grew up speaking Chinese and learned ASL at the age of 28. For the last 5 years, she has worked in the financial banking institutions in Minneapolis. Keenan is also a contractor with the commission, doing civic engagement and contacting individuals who need services. She's also an advocate with the commission who set up the first 100% open captioning theater in the state. Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm looking forward to asking several questions of all of you. Regina, you get the first question. As you identify as a Black woman and a person that is hard of hearing, how do you navigate the intersectionality of those identities when interacting with the general public?
That's a good question. Really, for me, I identify myself as Black, deaf or hard of hearing, a woman, and an educator. I navigate through an intersectional identity by code switching. So if I'm with a group of hearing people who are also Black, I'm either signing and speaking simultaneously or writing to communicate. If I'm with deaf or hard of hearing ASL users, then I don't have to adjust my communication. I feel pressured to accommodate the hearing group. With the deaf and hard of hearing group, I can express myself comfortably. It feels natural. What can make it harder is I am a Black woman. Often that's how people identify me first. Oh, she's Black and a woman. They don't realize that I'm also a person with hearing loss. There are other efforts that have to be made, mostly by me, to make sure I can meet their needs that are not necessary in other groups. Navigating those intersecting identities can be problematic, even today. People need so much education and exposure to see me for all of who I am and not just a Black woman.
Thank you so much for that answer. Now over to you, Patrick. Thank you for joining us today. Your question is a little different. As you identify as a white, gay, cisgendered man who identifies as deafblind, how are those identities and intersectionalities help you navigate through the deaf and hearing communities?
Thank you, TJay. Yes, I grew up hard of hearing with low vision. I could include a long list of additional identities, but I primarily identify as deafblind. When the general public sees that term, deafblind, they think of someone who is fully deaf and completely blind. But that's very, very rare and impacts about 1% of deafblind people who are completely deaf and blind. My identity is gay. I'm not fully out of the closet. My family raised us Catholic, and I hid my identity there. For how out I may present myself or whether I'm still in the closet. In the larger community, my identity impacts how I communicate. I can't understand speech, and so I bring an iPad for communication. I can read what someone writes, and I can type back a message for the iPad to read out loud. If I'm talking to someone deaf, we can often communicate through tactile ASL, making visual communication understandable through touch. Most of the time that works fine. As I just explained, when people see the word deafblind, they can create a problem. For example, when flying, I won't make that designation on my reservation. The agent might read it as a deafblind flyer and panic, thinking I need to be rescued. Instead, I now go directly to the airport without identifying myself as deafblind on my reservation. That way, I can show the agent directly that I am able to communicate and only need to be guided to the gate.
Thank you so much. And now over to you, Keenan. I'm curious, you were born in China and yet moved to the US. You are still connected to Asian diaspora and have a hearing loss, also identifying as hard of hearing. With those intersectionalities and as a person with a hearing loss within Asian culture, how does that work for you?
Okay, TJ, I am so happy you brought up Asian diaspora because in the US, I feel like Asians are often just lumped as one giant group. And like even on the surveys, we don't really get to like show like all of the different parts of the Asian experience, right? Like for example, we have refugees, we have immigrants, we have Asian adoptees, and all of those experiences are very, very different. For me, my background is I'm a first-generation immigrant, but I moved to the US when I was 2, so I grew up in a very much like American culture. So because of American immigration laws, the US only allowed high-skilled workers to come to the US from China. So that meant that I was really, really lucky that my parents, they had high education. And because of that, they were able to give me a lot of privileges in terms of focusing so much on my grades and academics and really setting me up for success.
You also mentioned hearing loss. As a person identifying with hearing loss and identifying within the Asian community, what is that experience like for you?
Honestly, it was kind of tough growing up because I moved to the US in 1995, and at that time, the only communication with the extended family was through like telephone. We didn't even have webcams back then. So growing up, like because we were first generation immigrants, it was just me, my parents, and my younger brother who came a little later. And so I never had a real connection with my grandparents on both sides of the family. For example, when my mom would call back home, they'd pass me the phone, but I have no idea what they're saying. So my parents, they would just always tell me what my grandma or my grandpa was saying, but then the conversation would be so short that even today, I've never really had a full conversation with any of my grandparents. Despite that, I feel like I've been so lucky that because we speak Chinese at home, I have such a close connection to my Chinese culture, even though it's only just me and my parents and my brother. For example, I'm fluent in Chinese. I celebrate all of the different Chinese holidays, and I love all of those holidays, and I have a lot of pride in my culture. But still, at the same time, it was hard to join the Chinese community in the US. We have a really thriving Chinese community, a Chinese diaspora community, but because I'm hard of hearing, it was so hard to even join the different community events, go to Chinese church, and even socialize both in English and in Chinese. So because of that, I never had a close connection to the Chinese community in the US, even though I'm so proud of my culture. And that's been tough for me. When I got older, I finally started learning ASL. And that gave me the opportunity to access environments, social environments that were fully accessible for me. But even then, in the deaf spaces that I've been in Minnesota, I meet very, very few people like me. I've been happy that I've been able to find a lot of Asian, deaf, hard of hearing people in Minnesota. But it was literally this year that I met my first Chinese deaf person. And before that, I never met another Chinese deaf or hard of hearing person. But even then, because of the Asian diaspora, she was adopted from China, and we had completely different experiences. Like we could connect because we both shared an American culture, but she didn't celebrate any of the holidays that I celebrated, and we didn't have a common language besides ASL. And so even now, I'm still trying to find people who are like me, and that it's something that I've had to get used to, but I also appreciate the fact that there's so much diversity in the Asian diaspora, because it means that there's so many different ways to connect with people. And I'm also so happy that I'm hard of hearing, because all of those different experiences just means that when I meet people from like other backgrounds, people who aren't Asian, other immigrants, we're able to find common and similar experiences, and I'm so happy for that. Thank you, TJay.
Thank you so much for sharing such a touching, robust story. Wow. And finally, over to you, Xavier, for your first question. I'm curious as to your experience looking back, what you've seen related to public accommodations, like meeting law enforcement or working with hospital systems. What have you experienced?
Yes. I remember an occasion that we were at the hospital. We were at the emergency room. We requested a sign language interpreter. I was waiting for the interpreter to arrive. When the interpreter arrived, we start our process, our conversation. It was something regarding to the one who was my wife at that moment, and something that was going on with her. We were in a conversation, the interpreter was interpreting, and suddenly, around probably 20 minutes after our conversation started, the interpreter fell over. The doctor did not notice that because he was only paying attention to me and my wife. I have to reroute his attention to the interpreter, and we have to pause everything. We were in shock. I was in shock. The interpreter fell over. The doctor decided to pause everything, took the interpreter away from the room. And then probably 10 minutes or so after that, they came back. The interpreter was back there. They gave water to the interpreter. And we reestablished our communication, our conversation a little bit more slower. I still was in shock. The interpreter was still in shock. We did not have a replacement interpreter for that because we were planning to have that interpreter for the afternoon and the overnight. And now looking back, I'm like, I should have a second interpreter at that time, but we did not have one. It was a hard situation.
That must have been scary for you. I mean, you want to focus on your spouse, but then it's diverted to the interpreter. And then you're stuck without a replacement interpreter and have a communication barrier.
Yes. It was, how can I explain?
Do you have other experiences you want to share?
Yes, I have another experience that happened to me related this time with the law enforcement. We were pulled over. That time I was driving, my wife was in the passenger seat, and my kids were in the back. My wife is deaf as well. We were pulled over, as I said. The cop came over. We informed the cop that we were deaf. The cop looked back on the back seat and started talking to my kids. Oh, at that time, my kids were 5 or 6 years old, around that age. And they were talking to my kids, and I thought that he meant ask him if they were my kids. I'm like, yeah, they're my kids. Until I realized when my kids touched me over, said they were trying to tell me what the cop was saying. So I realized that the cop was trying to use the kids as my interpreters, something that I didn't like, We were not receiving any ticket. We were excused. But at that time, I did not appreciate that the officer used my kids as an interpreter at that time,
In that moment, you kind of feel powerless, so to speak. Now I can't, it's disappointing.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And it was really disappointed. Really. I did not like that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Now over to you, Mai. Thank you for joining us. Question for you. What is your most memorable experience or interaction in the public sector with law enforcement or a hospital system or government court systems like that? Have you ever experienced barriers as a person with a hearing loss?
I remembered the first time I was pulled over by the cops with my brother in the passenger seat. I had just received my driver's license. I saw the lights flash and pulled over. During that time, no one taught me how to communicate with police officers as a deaf person. When the officer spoke to me, I was not sure how to respond or rely on my brother. I didn't know what to do. My brother told the officer she's deaf. Looking back, I should have told the officer I'm deaf or gestured that I can't hear. Instead, they depend on my brother to be my interpreter. Back then, I was young. Now, I've learned to become my own advocate and speak for myself. I'm deaf or gesturing I can't hear. That is something that I learned. The second situation are medical appointments. My medical appointments now are great, beautiful. But growing up, I would visit Hmong doctors and they do not provide ASL interpreting. They would speak Hmong and it would be incomprehensible to me. My mom sometimes interpreted a little bit. At age 18, I began to advocate for myself to visit white doctors because they provide ASL interpreters. Ever since then, I had no issues. The biggest impact are my kids' medical appointments. I'm a mom and my kid is a CODA. I will request interpreters for me with the doctors and they would decline the service because my son can talk. No, I want to know what is happening, specifically a dental visit for an emergency. I really struggle with having an ASL interpreter present at the dental office. Often there are no interpreters present. Except for one time, I would not give up and kept requesting for an ASL interpreter. I will call way ahead of time and they still struggle with communication access. I explained that I am deaf, my son is hearing, and I want to know what is happening to my son's dental health. It's my right as a mother to know. They depend on writing back and forth, but I don't want that. I want a direct line of communication in sign language because it's smoother and faster compared to writing a long message. I don't want that. I prefer to sign because it is smoother.
Thank you for that. So I'm curious, so I'll ask a follow-up question. Do you feel like the system is set up for the privileged and to oppress people with disabilities?
Yes, I feel that as a whole, the white community does not provide access. As a Hmong person, when they meet me, they assume I need a spoken Hmong interpreter, and I have to tell them I do not need a spoken Hmong interpreter, but an ASL interpreter, and really emphasize on ASL. I have another story to share. I went to a drive-through COVID testing site, and they saw me and sent out a Hmong soldier to interpret for me. I am deaf. I'm deaf. I do not speak Hmong. I had to write a note telling them I'm deaf. Even though they saw me as a Hmong individual, they assumed that I can speak Hmong. No, don't assume. Communicate with the individual to make sure that their needs are accommodated. Obviously, the system is set up for white privilege. If they look at me, they see a different color. We are not the same. I am Asian, specifically Hmong, and there are many large Hmong communities. Here in Minnesota, there is a very large Hmong community, but do they all speak Hmong? No. There are Hmong people with hearing loss, deaf, or hard of hearing who depend on different types of accommodations. It could be ASL or written messages or whatever it may be to fit that individual.
Thank you so much. Now our final question, and I will be curious about everyone's answers. Ma, you can go first. As you look to the future, do you have hopes of things improving for people with hearing loss? And for yourself as a person who identifies as Hmong and also having a hearing loss?
My hope for the future as a deaf Hmong person, I hope the Hmong community will become more aware of the access needs for the deaf and hard of hearing. Secondly, I hope we educate our younger children how to communicate with law enforcement rather than depend on the hearing family members to interpret. Like my experience when I depended on my brother to interpret. That should not have happened. So I hope that some deaf adults will educate kids, especially in minority groups like me, a Hmong person, living in primarily white space, to make things better. For medical providers, I hope that they are aware when they see me as Hmong, they won't assume that I need a spoken Hmong interpreter. For me, I need an ASL interpreter. I hope in the future those kinds of assumptions would not happen.
Great, thank you so much. And now, back to you, Patrick. Same question. What are your hopes for your communities in the future?
Thank you, TJay. I hope to change how identities like deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing, and so on are viewed. I want to improve communication, access, and teach people in the public so they can communicate better with people who are deaf and or blind, especially first responders like police and paramedics. Teaching them better communication will improve access all around.
Great, thank you. Javier, what are your thoughts?
I think that what we all need to do is educate people who work, and specifically people who work on public spaces. Those who work at the front lines, they should be aware of those who have a diversity in disabilities, also other individuals and their way of thinking. Those who work there cannot base their own decisions in their own point of view. They need to be patient, and they should be learning that from school. Let's start at elementary school, high school, college. Each educational level should have something short and concise about the needs of people around them and the diversity that there is, not only in Minnesota, but also in the United States with people with disability. That should be a requirement. And I think it will make everything less difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like having more intersectionality taught in our courses, with the different identities and the varying
Correct.
communities.
Yes.
And what are those needs?
Something like that. Also, people need to learn to be patient. I know so many people are not patient. I am not one, but I can deal with people.
Great, thank you. Regina, what do you think will happen in the future for people with a hearing loss, and also the varying identities and intersectionalities we've discussed?
I can think of several things, especially when it comes to being Black, whether you're male or female. I think that's where the most improvements need to be made. People need to take courses or workshops to learn how to work with the Black community, then Black deaf people, Black hard of hearing people, and more. People need to feel They know how to approach, communicate, and connect with the Black community, and that's what's missing. Then, for example, something that really struck me, I spend time socializing with both Black and white people. I notice when I'm with Black people, I feel a deeper connection because we share the same language and education. Compared to white people, we get along just fine, but there's still some code switching I find myself doing. At times, I see white people are somewhat doubtful, careful, wondering if they can be themselves. We feel the same way. How can we educate both groups, white and Black, to just take a moment to know it's okay to ask, it's okay to feel uncomfortable, to be comfortable. We need to have discussions about being patient, understanding, and also needing to be actively aware. We have to acknowledge this discomfort. We can't minimize or pretend there's no undercurrent there. In those moments in our everyday life, we forget. Education, especially for our young Black, deaf, and hard of hearing kids who are looking to us, that's so important. They are the hope we have for changing the system. We have to be empowering our future leaders. They are so precious to us.
Yeah, I've noticed that. As you mentioned, especially for the Black community, I think people with a hearing loss, they mostly identify within the white community. So I think what we have to do is change that, and hopefully they can recognize that Black people can have a hearing loss, and also they can be successful in their own community.
Right.
And just to role model that, right?
Right. At the same time, we need to recognize that the Black members of our community need to be proud of who they are. There is so much pressure and so often a feeling of I can't do or be who I am. Instead, we have to foster a sense of pride in all their identities, whether it's being deaf, blind, hard of hearing, a person with a cochlear implant, it doesn't matter. Each of us has a unique presence in the world. That's where often I think Black community members just assimilate the white community's way of being. We have to get in there and see beyond the majority view of us and discover that uniqueness. So how do we model that? That's the kind of education we need for the future, and hopefully we will see that change.
Thank you so much. Keenan, what do you think?
I don't have hopes. I have expectations for people. And I have expectations for two groups specifically. So for the people who are in like positions of power, for example, you're a hiring manager, you're a recruiter, you're part of the entire like recruitment pipeline. Are you making sure that your processes are accessible so that people with disabilities can even be at the table? That's one thing that I really, really think that more employers need to focus on, and that oftentimes accessibility is not the first thing they think about, but it should be. My second expectation is for the support systems we have here in Minnesota for deaf and hard of hearing people. Our systems are absolutely fantastic, and I really hope that what they take away from this panel is how important it is to understand what diaspora means and how that impacts the different BIPOC communities here. For example, if you're an immigrant moving from another country, your experience is going to be different from someone who grew up in the US for generations. And that's for all races, Black, Latinx, Asian, all of it. And you need to really be sure that you're actively changing how you do outreach to make sure that you're reaching all of those communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of DHHSD, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Xavier, Regina, Patrick, Mai, and Keenan, for sharing their experiences and perspectives as people who are deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing, and also as members of the BIPOC and LGBTQ communities. I hope you have learned a little bit about the diversity within our communities. People who are deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing come from many different cultures and varying backgrounds, and they have fascinating stories to share about their experiences. Some of our panelists discussed the importance of community and building relationships with others that have similar experiences and backgrounds. Other common themes that have emerged from our discussion here today were the importance of communication in all areas of life, whether it's with colleagues at work, or meeting new people, or in public services such as transportation, law enforcement, or even healthcare. We also learned it is important not to make assumptions about people's identities or their communication needs. The differences in people's lived experiences are fascinating to learn about, and we should appreciate them all. For all of our differences, we still have a lot in common. That is why it is so important to view each person you meet as an individual. Thank you again for joining us. If you're interested in learning more, please check out our other videos in this series.
Copyright 2022, State of Minnesota, Department of Human Services. Produced by Minnesota Department of Human Services, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division. 444 Lafayette Road, St. Paul, Minnesota 55155. Voice or preferred relay service 800-657-3663. Video phone 651-964-1514. Website mn.gov/deaf-hard-of-hearing. The Minnesota Department of Human Services, DHS, prohibits discrimination in its public services because of race, color, creed, religion, political beliefs, national origin, sex, public assistance status, marital status, age, sexual orientation, or disability. Direct discrimination complaints to DHS Civil Rights Coordinator at dhs.info@state.mn.us or 651-431-2000. People with disabilities may request reasonable modifications to receive DHS services by contacting its Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator at dhs_ada@state.mn.us or 651-431-3040.